In the debate between Kirk Cousins and Justin Fields, I'm going to break down exactly why the Falcons will absolutely choose Kirk Cousins.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back, everyone, to another illustrious episode of the Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of Locked On Sports Atlanta, your team every day. And if you don't know me, I'm your very humble host, Aaron Freeman, a.k.a. Sirius Black, a.k.a. Mr. Drew, a.k.a. the Jolly Green Giant, a.k.a. Mr. a.k.a. And of course, the very humble host of this illustrious podcast. And I think each and every one of you that is an everydayer of this illustrious podcast. And all you got to do to become an everydayer so that you can too be illustrious is subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. So coming up on today's illustrious podcast, and if you're wondering why I keep saying illustrious, because I know some of you guys have a drinking game. Every time I say illustrious, you drink. So, let's get right. Let's close out the week by getting right. But coming up on today's illustrious podcast, right, we're going to be breaking down two defensive tackle prospects from the University of Texas, Byron Murphy II and Tandre Sweat, and why I think Murphy is a low-level sleeper for the Falcons' first-round pick, and why I don't necessarily think Sweat is going to be on the Falcons' radar at any point in the draft. We'll also talk about some of the downsides of the Falcons potentially signing Kirk Cousins and why that move isn't a long-term solution at the quarterback position. But we're going to start today's episode by kind of clearing the air when it comes to the Kirk Cousins versus Justin Fields debate, right? And if you've been listening to this podcast, I've been pushing the idea that the Falcons are going to likely pursue Kirk Cousins. Haven't really been pushing that for Justin Fields, right? You've heard me label it as Kirk Cousins is plan B for the Falcons at quarterback, and while Justin Fields is plan D. And I feel compelled to clear the air because I got hit up yesterday by a Locked On Falcons insider. Shout out to you, Cody. And you can talk this spicy to me if you're a paying customer, as the Locked On Falcons insiders are. If you want to join that, by all means, hit the link in the description below at joinsubtext.com/LockedOnFalcons, 14-day free trial, then $4.99 a month. You get access to my film reviews. About to drop a Drake May breakdown this week. Already did Caleb Williams, did JJ McCarthy, got Jaden Daniels coming up. So go check it out if you haven't already. But this person basically said, to me, and that one-on-one connection that you get by becoming a Locked On Falcons insider is he said I was horny for Kirk Cousins as a pickup. And I had to kind of set him straight. I'm not pushing Kirk Cousins because that's the move that I think is the right move for the Falcons. As we get later in today's episode, you'll hear some of the reasons why I don't love that move for the Atlanta Falcons. But I push that because I think it's the most likely outcome. And I'm using logic and reason and rationality to come to that conclusion that I think when you really break it down, the odds really point in the direction of the Falcons if the opportunity is there. And that is certainly a debate on whether they'll get that opportunity. But if they have a chance to pursue Kirk Cousins, they will absolutely choose him over, say, Justin Fields. And it's threefold, right? It comes down to the pressure to win, scheme fit, and a belief in the player. And that first thing, pressure to win, right? I know QB wins is not a meaningful stat, but when you look at Kirk Cousins' career win percentage as a starter quarterback in the NFL over a 17-game season, he has averaged about 9 wins. You look at Justin Fields, and that same metric would be about 4.5 wins, right? And this is meaningful because we sit here and we go, why is Raheem Morris currently the Atlanta Falcons head coach? Because Arthur Smith got fired. Why did Arthur Smith get fired? Arthur Smith got fired because he didn't win games. And if you're Raheem Morris coming into this building, you're going to feel that pressure to win, right? They didn't fire Arthur Smith so that they can go, 7-10 again. Right? They fired Arthur Smith because they believe that they're capable of going 10-7. And if you're looking at those two numbers, where one quarterback has won twice as many games as a starter. And again, I know QB wins are overrated, but if you're betting on who's more likely to get me to 10 wins, Kirk Cousins or Justin Fields, to me, it's understandable why you would think, again, I think it's a no-brainer why this regime would side on Kirk Cousins. Now, the second issue is scheme fit when it comes to what offense that Zach Robinson is going to run. Now, we don't know that 100%, but he comes from the Sean McVay school. And you look at Kirk Cousins' 12 years in the NFL. 10 of those years, he has played in a Mike Shanahan, Kyle Shanahan, Sean McVay derivative offense, right? 2 years under Kyle Shanahan to start his career in Washington, then 3 years when Sean McVay was the play caller in Washington. Then he goes to Minnesota. He spent 3 years in Gary Kubiak adjacent systems under Kevin Stefanski, Gary Kubiak and Clint Kubiak, right? And Gary Kubiak is basically the brother offense of the Kyle Shanahan offense because they both stem from the Mike Shanahan offense. And then the last 2 years under Kevin O'Connell, who learned, from Sean McVay in LA. And Kirk is a proven producer for basically a decade in very similar schemes, right? He's been consistently a top 10, top 15 caliber quarterback playing in that system. You compare that to Justin Fields, who's spent 3 years in Chicago playing in West Coast systems under Matt Nagy and Luke Getsy. Now, Matt Nagy runs a West Coast offense that is derivative of the Andy Reid offense, which is a cousin of the Shanahan offenses, right? Because Andy Reid learned from Mike Holmgren while Kyle Shanahan and Sean McVay learned from Mike Shanahan. Those are two diverging points. They all came from Bill Walsh in the 70s and 80s in San Francisco, but they're sort of two diverging systems. Luke Getsy learned under first Mike McCarthy when he was in Green Bay, and Mike McCarthy is also a student of the West Coast offense under Paul Hackett, another Bill Walsh assistant from the 80s. And he also learned in Green Bay recently under Matt LaFleur, who's a derivative of the McVay and Shanahan offense. And you compare Kirk Cousins as a proven producer in a very similar scheme to what Zach Robinson is expected to run, while meanwhile, Justin Fields has struggled running cousin schemes, right? And so, again, it's proven versus project, right? Kirk Cousins is proven, Justin Fields is a project. And if you're sitting there going, what are you going to bet on? I think they're going to bet on the proven guy. Now, of course, everybody says, oh, Robinson's going to adapt his scheme, Aaron. And of course, Arthur Smith said he was going to adapt his scheme to the quarterback. And again, maybe Zach Robinson is being truthful while Arthur Smith didn't necessarily do that. But if you're going to adapt your scheme, right, if you're going to bet, you're going to bet on a player that is proven top 10 producer in this type of offense versus a player that proven bottom 10 quarterback in similar offenses. Then we get to the third point. So if it's not clear, I think they're going to bet on the proven guy. Third point, you can disregard all of this if you believe in the player. If you truly believe, we don't care about what Justin Fields has done in the past. We believe in him moving forward. And certainly the argument for Justin Fields really boils down to what he's going to do in the next couple of years versus what you think Kirk Cousins is going to do due to his injury, right? But more on that later, right? But so you can disregard that. And, there's this notion of this is a do-over offseason for the Falcons because they hired Raheem Morris, who they could have possibly hired in 2021. And maybe they do over the NFL draft where, instead of taking Kyle Pitts, they could have taken Justin Fields. And it's fun to think about, in a world where the Falcons did stick with Raheem Morris back in 2021, rather than hiring Arthur Smith, would they have drafted Fields? It's certainly an interesting thought exercise. And I certainly think you can make an argument that there's an alternative reality where that's the case. But when it comes down to believing in the player, Raheem Morris doesn't know Justin Fields. Why would he believe in the player? He does know Kirk Cousins because he was part of that Washington staff with Kyle Shanahan and Sean McVay for the first 3 years of Kirk Cousins' career. Now, Kirk Cousins was a backup to RG3 then, but Raheem Morris was in the building with Kirk Cousins. Raheem Morris has no connection to Justin Fields, right? The only time the Rams have played Justin Fields or the Bears the last 3 years was the season opener in 2021. So Justin Fields' first NFL game where he played 5 snaps in that game behind Andy Dalton. And so if you're going to bet on Raheem Morris and the decision makers in Atlanta to buy into the player, who do you think is the better bet? The player that Raheem Morris actually knows or this completely stranger to him? Not to mention Terry Fontenot still part of this team. And Terry Fontenot, if he truly believed in Justin Fields as a player, maybe would have drafted him 3 years ago. But, is he more likely to believe in Justin Fields as a player he's not been around for 3 years today than he did 3 years ago? Again, I think that's very debatable. So could Justin Fields become an Atlanta Falcon? Absolutely. I think that path is mostly if Kirk Cousins is not available. Again, a lot of fans assume, and I understand why, that Kirk Cousins will re-sign with the Minnesota Vikings. It doesn't seem that people that actually cover the Vikings seem to think that that is as much of a slam dunk as I think a lot of fans outside of Minnesota seem to think, especially those in the state of Georgia. Right now, basically that situation has to play out over the next 3 weeks. The Vikings have 3 weeks basically between now and the middle of March to, redo a deal with Kirk Cousins. But if he hits the open market, there's a very high probability that he's going to wind up being an Atlanta Falcon. Now, if he doesn't hit the open market, then the odds that Justin Fields is going to be the quarterback for the Atlanta Falcons, the next quarterback for the Atlanta Falcons, shoot up. But we'll see. We'll see how that plays out. But that's why I continue to be, quote unquote, horny for Kirk Cousins, because I just sit here and I go, it's not because I think Kirk Cousins is a slam dunk of a quarterback. It's just simply because I think if you're just reading the tea leaves, if you're just connecting dots, as we often do on this podcast, right? No inside information, but all signs point to the Falcons preferring Kirk Cousins over Justin Fields. Now, as I said, I don't think Kirk Cousins is a slam dunk move. And I think essentially, and I'll make this argument as we continue today's Locked On Falcons, that adding him is basically a very expensive punt at the position. And we'll break that down as we continue today's episode. Now, guys, are you the kind of driver that likes to push things a little further? Ever wonder what adventure could be around the next corner? Our friends at Nissan have a lineup of SUVs with capabilities to take your next adventure to that next level. And the 2024 Nissan Rogue is perfect for city drives and great escapes. It's a perfect midsize crossover for your next adventure. I can attest to this because I rented a Nissan Rogue a couple of weeks ago when I was down in Mobile for the Senior Bowl. And I had so many NFL insiders like Tom Pelissero commenting on the 12.3-inch HD touchscreen infotainment system that no longer needs a phone to connect, apps like Google Assistant, Google Maps, and the Google Play Store because it's built right in. And Tom was curious about what other offerings that Nissan has, and I had to tell him about the 2024 Nissan Armada that will change what you expect with a full-size SUV. Just picture, Tom, a rugged 4x4 that can seat up to 8 in first-class luxury and style, tow bigger, and explore further in the 2024 Nissan Armada. So take the Nissan Rogue, the Nissan Armada, or the Nissan Pathfinder and go find your next big adventure, Tom, by going to shopnissanusa.com. So continuing today's Locked On Falcons, want to plug the 24/7 streaming channel of Locked On Sports today, giving you the biggest headlines across all the leagues, national sports, local experts, all available on YouTube, the first of its kind. And if you want more local flavor, check out the Locked On Sports Atlanta's 24/7 streaming channel right here on YouTube as well. All part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. So let's talk about the potential pitfalls of signing Kirk Cousins. I don't think Kirk Cousins is like automatic slam dunk. Oh, the Falcons are going to be good now. I think more likely it's going to be a path to being competent and mediocre, but probably not much more than that, if I'm being completely honest. But we've talked a little bit about the sort of parallels between Justin Fields and Sam Darnold and why the Falcons have to be willing to pay attention to what the Panthers did 3 years ago when they traded for Sam Darnold and avoid some of those same pitfalls that they found in, most notably when it comes to the decision if and when the Falcons trade for Justin Fields to extend that fifth-year option. The Panthers did it with Sam Darnold. I've seen a lot of folks assuming that the Falcons will do it with Justin Fields. I don't think that's the case. I think more than likely you'll get Justin Fields and the Falcons to do sort of a mini one-year extension in the same ways that the Packers did with Jordan Love last year, that gives Justin Fields some guaranteed money in 2025, but not the 20 plus 22 million in guarantees that he would get if the Falcons gave that fifth-year option sight unseen. But paying attention to Carolina's pitfalls, makes a ton of sense. But you can also, when it comes to Kirk Cousins, there's another NFC South team that has a lot of parallels, and that's the New Orleans Saints when they signed Derek Carr last year. That in a lot of ways that the Falcons signing Kirk Cousins is very similar to what the Saints did a year ago signing Derek Carr. Now, the first year of Derek Carr was okay, I guess you could say, for the Saints. And we'll see if it's better in year two in Clint Kubiak's offense versus Pete Carmichael's offense. So we'll see about that. But to be honest with you, when I sort of compare what I would expect from Kirk Cousins in 2024 in Atlanta versus what the Saints got from Derek Carr in 2023 in New Orleans, I kind of think they'll probably be the same. I think really you're hoping that year two under Kirk Cousins is going to be blossoming because, again, coming off that Achilles, coming into a brand new system, brand new players, like I'm not expecting Kirk Cousins to hit the ground running immediately in year one. And it's really like, okay, let's see what he can do in 2025. Right. But you compare that to Derek Carr, who signed a 4-year deal with the Saints last year worth, I think, $150 million, but it really boiled down to like a 2-year, $60 million contract. And now the Saints are stuck paying that second year of the contract with Derek Carr, and they might have to pay a third year if they wind up restructuring it between now and the start of the year to get cap compliant. And they're already looking to potentially upgrade that spot. And it doesn't seem likely that JJ McCarthy, who's the projected QB4 out of Michigan in this draft, is going to fall to them at 14 in round one. It's possible, but with so many QB needy teams, a lot of teams would have to pass on JJ McCarthy for him to be there at 14. But if he were to be there, you would expect the Saints to potentially jump at the chance to pick him up so that they could, grease the wheels to move on from Derek Carr. And so for me, in a lot of ways, Kirk Cousins and Derek Carr are very similar, that they've had a lot of success in the NFL, but they're productive players, but they don't get a lot of team success. Like Kirk Cousins has been a 9-year starter in the NFL. Teams have only made the playoffs 3 times, 2015 in Washington, 2019, which was the second year in Minnesota, and 2022, where the Vikings, won a lot of one-score games that they probably had no business winning. And pretty much every other year of Kirk Cousins, you're winning 7, 8, 9 games a year is pretty consistently the case for not both Washington and Minnesota. And that's kind of the main knock on Kirk Cousins, that in the same way with Derek Carr, who was productive for many years with Las Vegas and in Oakland, but they weren't necessarily winning a ton of playoff games in those years. You're going to get competent quarterback play, but you're kind of competent is basically another term for mediocre in the larger scheme of things. That your ceiling potentially is really like a 9 or 10 win team that can maybe make the playoffs. Maybe if you get a favorable matchup, in the first round of the playoffs, you can make it to the second round of the playoffs, but you're not a true contender past that is basically. And unless you're going to have an elite supporting cast around Kirk Cousins, like you're probably not going to get more than that. Right. And so to me, that's why I sit here and I say, like, while I think Kirk Cousins is the likeliest outcome, it's not something that I'm quote unquote horny for, as Cody would say, because to me, it's just punting, right? You're basically saying, come in here and give us competent play for 2, maybe 3 years. And hopefully in that 2 or 3 year period of time where we're just kind of not treading water is probably not the right word, but something a little bit better than that. Maybe you're treading water with a life preserver and, you got some webbed flippers on or whatever, it's some, I can't think of the equivalent off the top of my head, but you know what I'm saying? Like you're not just simply treading water, but maybe you maybe got a Mai Tai in your you're at a pool in Las Vegas and you got a nice drink in your hand and you're just treading water in the pool. That's basically the best case scenario, I think, so you're feeling good about treading water, but that's all you're really doing. If you're following what I'm saying. And so you're hoping as you tread water with a drink in your hand over the next 2 or 3 years, you're hoping that a better opportunity to upgrade the quarterback comes along, right? That Kirk Cousins isn't solving your quarterback situation. You're just basically saying, we'll deal with it later, right? And so that's why, like, I'm not that horny for Kirk Cousins. I just recognize it as really kind of the best out of a bunch of potential bad options for the Falcons, right? That you're probably going to be in the same situation that Minnesota finds themselves in, which is like, yeah, we've been a competitive team for the last 5-6 years under Kirk Cousins, but we feel like there's so much more room for growth. And that's really what the Falcons are basically hoping for. And certainly I think given Kirk Cousins at age, right, at this point in time, that, the player that the Vikings were inheriting at 30, they were getting the prime of Kirk Cousins then. And the Falcons, barring some late career resurgence from Kirk Cousins, are not getting the prime of Kirk Cousins. So you might not even get what the Vikings have gotten the last couple of years, which is a couple of playoff appearances. And so that to me is the downside of Kirk Cousins. So again, I don't sit here and say, oh man, Kirk Cousins is this great option for the Falcons. I just sit here and I go, like, he's probably the most likely option should he become available, given the reasons that we broke down earlier. But we will leave that conversation aside. I'm sure we will spend a lot more time talking about Kirk Cousins and Justin Fields over the next 3+ weeks on this podcast. But we'll wrap up today's episode looking at some draft prospects. We'll look ahead to April and look at 2 defensive tackles from Texas in Byron Murphy II, one of whom could be our Grady Jarrett heir apparent, and the other one, Tandre Sweat, despite being this massive nose tackle, I don't know if is as good a fit as maybe some people think. And we'll break that down to wrap up today's Locked On Falcons. But guys, I want to tell you that this next segment is brought to us by our sponsor, BetterHelp. And sometimes we all need the opportunity to get something off our chest, big or small. Certain things can really start to get to you. It's important to let that out, especially as someone who's unbiased in your life. And I got some things I got to let out, about some 2-down nose tackles, right? And certainly in Tandre Sweat's case, he's a very big problem. But, whether you need to deal with that, therapy can be different for everyone, right? Most of us have bigger problems than our favorite sports team and who they might draft. And it's important to get those things off your chest every once in a while. So if you're thinking of starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try. It's entirely online. It's designed to be flexible and suited to your schedule. Visit betterhelp.com/lockedon and you'll get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/lockedon. So before we wrap up today's Locked On Falcons, I do want to give you guys a heads up for especially the audio listeners that there will be a delay in when this episode drops on Monday due to some technical behind the scenes issues. That you probably won't get the Monday audio version of the podcast until the afternoon on Monday, rather than it being ready for your morning commutes. So the YouTube will go up probably on Sunday night, barring some unexpected event. So you'll still be able to check it out just on YouTube Monday morning. But just want to give you guys that heads up. So, I know there's going to be a couple of you that hit me up like, where's the podcast? Where's the podcast Monday morning? And that's the reason. But let's talk about life after Grady Jarrett. And we discussed this yesterday on the podcast on, mentioning Grady Jarrett as a possibility of being cap cut. And I broke down why I don't think that's likely to happen. But one of the themes that you've heard me talk about a bunch of times this offseason so far is the Falcons need to start preparing for life after Grady Jarrett and life after Jake Matthews to a lesser extent. And the hope is that they will be better prepared for life after those fixtures, depart, than they have been in life after Matt Ryan and Julio Jones. You can argue that the bulk of their current issues right now and why Raheem Morris has a job here in Atlanta right now today is because the Falcons did not properly prepare for life after Matt Ryan and Julio Jones, not, in terms of the quarterback and replacing one of the most explosive receivers in NFL history. And you don't want to see a similar issue come up for the Falcons in terms of Grady Jarrett and Jake Matthews, because, we've seen this team make progress the last couple of years in improving the trenches, and you don't want to see them backslide in that regard. So, I want to talk about two potential prospects from Texas, and Byron Murphy the second, and Tandre Sweat. I watched 3 games of theirs today, and Murphy is interesting to me because he's kind of a sleeper for the Falcons' first round pick. I've seen a bunch of mocks that have him in that 11 to 15 range, and to me, it's not crazy to think that between now and April, we might see more mocks mocking him in the top 10, especially given potential needs that teams like Atlanta at 8 and Chicago at 9 have at that position. Now, I've seen a couple of mocks that have Sweat going in the late first round, but I think most people are projecting him as a second round guy. We'll circle back to why I'm skeptical of where he ultimately goes in that regard. But talking about Murphy, he reminds me a lot of a young Grady Jarrett, right? He plays a lot of nose tackle for Texas. And I think a lot of people would be surprised to know that Byron Murphy has gotten more snaps at nose tackle the last 3 years at Texas than Tandre Sweat has. It's similar to the dynamic between Grady Jarrett and Dontari Poe in 2017 that a lot of people assume, Dontari Poe was the nose tackle. No, he was the 3 tech, and Grady Jarrett was the nose tackle for that team playing that 1 technique role. And, Grady Jarrett spent the bulk of his first 3 years in the NFL playing that 1 technique nose tackle role. And Byron Murphy plays that similar role for Texas right now. But has, like Grady Jarrett, I think the explosiveness to be a very disruptive 3 technique if he were to play that. So he gives you some, positional flexibility at that D tackle position. He was part of the Bruce Feldman freak list last year. And so the expectation he's going to tear up the combine. And if he does, then we might be hearing more about him being a potential option for the Falcons. And I think it makes a ton of sense for Byron Murphy because of that nose tackle ability, that when we talk about the Falcons needing a nose tackle now that they're moving to the 3-4, and you look at the types of nose tackles that Raheem Morris's defense have had the last couple of years in LA, it's not been this sort of big wide body guy that I think a lot of people assume. It's been Greg Gaines, it's been Kobe Turner, it's been Bobby Brown, and Murphy fits more in that notion. And then you compare that to, say, Jimmy Lake at Washington. When he was at Washington, they had some big guys like Danny Shelton and Vita Vea. But when you look at when Jimmy Lake was the true blue D coordinator there, it was Greg Gaines that was their nose tackle rather than the big, 340-pound space eaters that those guys are. And so I think because of the Vea connection, a lot of people will be like, oh, that's what, Jimmy Lake wants in his defense or whatever. And you look at Tandre Sweat as a sort of natural fit in that role. And again, he hasn't really played that role, but certainly I think it's understandable why people would project him to that role. And Sweat is interesting at the Senior Bowl. He had some very good reps in one-on-ones, being able to bully centers in the Senior Bowl. He opted against weighing in at the Senior Bowl, which was notable because, it speaks to some other things. But I'm not the world's biggest fan of Tandre Sweat. I think he's kind of a 2-down guy that's not really worth a top 100 pick. So to me, I would wait till day 3 to draft him. Again, I know he's being mocked as a top 50 pick, but I compare him to the last 2 drafts that have produced other similar nose tackles, right? He's not a one-of-one freak like Jordan Davis, so that's not a fair comparison. But you could maybe compare him to Travis Jones and Siaki Ika, who've come out the last 2 years. And both of those players were at this point being mocked as top 50 picks, but quote unquote fell to the 3rd round. Now, I don't think saying they fell is accurate, but I think that's the NFL kind of telling us that they only value that type of player as 3rd round players. And I think Jones and Ika were better prospects. That's my personal opinion. I know maybe other people will disagree on that. And I think you watch, watching these 3 games, like there's 1 or 2 snaps every game where you see Tandre Sweat and you see him being disruptive and all these various things, winning with a swim move or whatever. But like those reps are kind of few and far between. And to me, I'm not going to buy into a prospect just based off of like 2 flashes that he showed, certainly not in the top 50 in the draft. And part of it is because of my core belief that I think 2-down run pluggers like a Tandre Sweat are kind of a dime a dozen. Right? Like I can go out on the street and find a very similar guy that's going to give me basically what I'm projecting Tandre Sweat to give me in 3 or 4 years, and might give me that in 3 or 4 years. I can get that player right now in free agency with a proven veteran. And this is part of the reason why I don't believe in drafting using premium picks on 2-down run pluggers, right? If you need a body, take a flyer on that guy in round 5, 6, or 7. Okay, that's fine. Versus drafting a special teams guy. But, to me, using a premium pick on that guy. And the example I would use is Jonathan Hankins, who is a free agent this offseason, along with other players like Lecky Fotu and Josh Tupou, that if you're looking for a space heater, just go sign one in free agency. But look at Jonathan Hankins. He was a 2nd-round pick back in 2013 for the New York Giants, number 49th overall selection. So he was a top 50 selection. He was a productive starter for the Giants for 4 years. But then when he hit free agency, they moved on from him because teams don't pay 2-down players, right? Or they don't pay premiums for 2-down players. So you're drafting these guys as these 1-contract players. And again, not to say that this is the only factor and variable that goes into drafting a player, but if I'm going to use a top 100 pick on a player, I'm going to hope that player is going to be more than a 1-contract player. And if he is going to be a 1-contract player, like say a running back might be, at least that guy's going to give me a lot more value than what I think a 2-down run plugger is going to give me, over the life of that rookie contract, right? So that's the case for, drafting a Bijan Robinson or a Nick Chubb or, whoever else in the top 100 picks, even if you know that running backs don't have the longevity. But like you look at Jonathan Hankins over the last 7 years, he's been kind of a journeyman guy, played with the Colts, played a lot with the Raiders, recently with the Cowboys and whatnot. And Jonathan Hankins is basically going to give you exactly what you're hoping Tandre Sweat's going to give you in a couple of years if Tandre Sweat develops. So I'm not a huge fan of that sort of notion of drafting a guy like Sweat. I think a lot of people were sort of like, oh, we're moving back to a 3-4. We need a nose tackle. Go get the 380+ pound guy in Tandre Sweat. We could explore it further, but I'll leave it at that point. I think some of the out of shape question marks that surrounded Jordan Davis are much bigger red flags with Tandre Sweat than they were with Jordan Davis. And, we haven't seen Jordan Davis quite live up to the hype yet. So we'll see what he does in year 3 for those guys, but we'll see. So, Byron Murphy, yes. Tandre Sweat, is basically the final conclusion. So that's going to do it for us here on today's episode. I hope you guys have a great weekend. If you want to check out my Drake May film breakdown, hit the link in the description at joinsubtext.com/LockedOnFalcons. Again, 14-day free trial and $4.99 a month thereafter. You'll get access to all of my film breakdowns, whether it's all 22 reviews, extended all 22 reviews from the regular season, as well as any prospect and free agent breakdowns. At some point, we'll we'll probably get into Kirk Cousins and Justin Fields film a little bit later this offseason as we get into March or something like that. So that will be something else in store for you. But it's all part of Locked On Podcast Network, guys, your team every